But welcome everybody to the first SOS Community Day in India. My name is Ram. I work with the community in India on behalf of the Open SSF, and it's my absolute pleasure to see a lot of you here. Now, obviously, in true Indian fashion, we'll see more people trickle in through the morning and blame everything on traffic as opposed to their laziness. But let's kick things off. And first up, to give the welcome and opening remarks, we have Arun Gupta from Intel. Arun is serving on the governing board of the OpenSSF in addition to the CNCF. If you can meet him later after the talk, you can talk to him a lot about how the whole open source thing works and how well these foundations are doing and what you can do to participate. So let's hear it from Arun. Please give a big Delhi round of applause to Arun to kick things off.
So I'm very excited to be here. This is my home city, where I grew up, and it reminds me of Delhi ki sardi, like that chill that's coming back here. So it's pretty exciting. I work I work at Intel. I work at Intel. I lead the developer programs team over there. So anything related to developers is where my team gets engaged. Workshops, hackathons, student ambassadors, open source events, open source foundations. And I've been involved with the foundations for a very long time, particularly with the Linux Foundation. As Ram said, I'm on the OpenSSF governing board, and I'm also the governing board chair. So in terms of working with the different governing board members, member companies, technical advisory council on what's the future direction of the project, of the foundation. So I drive a lot of that, working with several members. If you have any questions around any of that, not just OpenSSF, but general Linux Foundation, I'm also on the CNCF governing board and the governing board chair there as well. So any question around CNCF, OpenSSF, LF, I'm happy to answer. Let's get started here. Okay, all right, so, I think this is really a call out that the reason, first of all, give yourself a hand of applause because this is the first SOS Community Day. So it's pretty exciting, actually. We really hope to continue this, build more enthusiasm, build more excitement around it, because by a show of hands, how many people use a software and there is no open source component in it? No hands, right? So you understand the importance. How many people, when they're using their software, would not like it to be secure? No hands, right? So we are all using open source in some shape and form, and the security of that software is super critical, super important, and that's what this SOS Day is about. It's really, we think at a global level, and then we execute events at a regional level to bring people together, bring community together, talk about why secure open source software matters. So that's where we want to bring you all together and share what all is happening in the broader secure open source community. Let's take a look at Linux Foundation. If you think about Linux Foundation is a Uber umbrella foundation. Within that, there are different child foundations, and OpenSSF and CNCF are two of such children foundations. But in terms of Linux Foundation, what does it offer, really? It offers a wide spectrum, essentially, if you think about it. It has anything from open data, think in terms of the overage maps, and anybody can contribute to the map information part of it, virtual maps rather. Open source software, of course, that's sort of the prime of what LF offers, whether it's PyTorch or cloud native software or open source software, any of that, there are a bunch of foundations in there. Open hardware, RISC-V is evolving really fast and emerging quite rapidly in terms of how do we make that open hardware. Community specifications like Salsa, and there are talks about that later today, industry standards, and similarly international standards. So Linux Foundation in that sense is that community where everybody kind of comes together and talk about open, whether it's source or hardware or standards or specifications. Now, if we go a level deeper, then let's take a look at it. Why open source software is so critical? I mean, if you think about it, 90% of general code bases contain OSS. If you have sent an email today, there is open source software engaged in there. If you have sent a DM to somebody, somewhere in the stack, open source software is involved. If you have checked a map, if you have taken an Uber, whatever you have done, if you have used an app somewhere, heck, iPhone, Android, those are the two most prominent mobile phones. They have open source components in there. So in that sense, no matter what you do, open source is very much part of your life. And if you think about the number of components, open source components per app are only increasing. We are heading towards this direction where we're going to do more microservices, more modular components. But what that means is we are actually leveraging more open source components. So as the open source presence becomes more prevalent in our things to do, is the security of that software is that much more critical. Now, these are some of the incidents that we have seen over the last decade or so. And really, Heartbleed was probably the first major incident that really brought open source security to the limelight. This is smack happening in the kernel and is impacting at a very massive level. Then we had shell shock. Then we had, the events just kept happening. All these CVEs, and you can look at the NVD, which is National Vulnerability Database, and you can take a look at it, what these CVEs are happening and what their numbers are. And the whole idea here is that these CVEs continue to increase and their sophistication continues to increase. They're not just straight up software vulnerabilities. There are social engineering attacks that are happening where people will act as a maintainer, but they have a malicious intent and they will inject a vulnerability in there. How many of you remember 2021? We are smack in the middle of pandemic, holiday season, and Log4Shell hits us. And now we are all scrambling, trying to figure out what do we do? And so those are the challenges that really exactly that we need to address. And these are only a few, and this is only a start. It's only going to get more intense. The quality of these attacks and the extent of these attacks is only going to happen more and more. So as I say, failure is inevitable. We cannot avoid it. We have to embrace it. I think is the key element that the lesson is coming out of it. So what is OpenSSF? We went through this exercise over the last few months. We call this as an MVSR strategy, MVSR exercise. And MVSR is a standard exercise that we do, basically talking about what is the mission of the organization, what is the vision of the organization, what is the strategy, and then we explicitly decouple the roadmap of it. Because the roadmap is going to be more dynamic and will continue to evolve, but the mission, vision, and strategy can continue to be exactly the same, right? So in terms of the mission, if you see, the idea is to make the open source software sustainable by securing it. And when we talk about open source software, we're really talking about the consumption and the production, both of that, as part of your software supply chain. And this would be done by really collaborating with a wide set of players. OpenSSF is only enabling it, but it really relies upon all the industry partners on how do we make this successful. So that's sort of the broader mission of the OpenSSF. In terms of the vision, we all know open source is a digital public good. What that means is, whatever we are building on as part of our strategic infrastructure, we start with open source. By default, you start with a Linux kernel that, okay, let me figure out, Ubuntu or wherever it is. On top of that, I want to use Python, which is again open source. I want to use Java, which is again open source. I want to use Go, which is again open source. Then I want to deploy on top of Kubernetes, which is again open source. So all throughout the stack, and if you want to deploy on RISC-V, that is again open hardware. So all throughout the stack, that is there. So it's a digital public good. So the whole idea is we envision a future where you can use open source that is universally trusted, secure, and reliable. That, in a sense, is sort of the vision for the OpenSSF. And how we break it down in terms of strategy is a 5-pillar strategy, right? There is an education and targeted comms, which is sort of the biggest impact. Basically talking about events like this, that, hey, what's the relevance of open source software? How do we raise the awareness around all these vulnerabilities? Then the second part really is around facilitate collaboration across different industry players. And OpenSSF in that sense is unique because pretty much other foundations, they have a very technology-centric angle. OpenSSF has a technology-centric angle, but it also has a very key policy angle as well, working with the federal bodies as well. So for example, back in US, there is CISA, or Center for which is basically responsible for cybersecurity for the US federal government. Then similarly, there are similar bodies in the Europe as well. So the whole idea is how do we work with private industries, federal government, and academia to make this all a unified mission. So that's sort of how the strategy is broken down into 5 different pillars. And I would highly recommend if you go to openssf.org, take a look at About Us, and it kind of calls out what that looks like. To break it down a little bit further, we divide this into 3 different categories. So inform, equip, and engage. Inform is basically you can take a look at it. Hey, there are vulnerability disclosures that we need to inform as we find out about them. What do we do with them and how do we operate them? Then there is a secure critical projects working group. And in those working groups is where the developers and people like you get together and talk about how do we take that mission forward. What does it mean to secure critical projects? There is a DevRel working group, which is basically, we talked about targeted comms and education and awareness, that can I explain somebody to what the purpose of OpenSSF is and how do you engage? And more recently is evolving the AI/ML security working group, because as AI is becoming more and more prominent, what does it mean to secure your AI? What does it mean to secure your Gen AI application? How does it different? And what does it mean if there's a patch in an LLM? How do you patch it? What does it mean to have guardrails in your application? That's sort of the inform part of it. Then the equip part of it is, again, these are working groups. There's a best practices working group, which basically tells you that, hey, if you want to secure your software, this is sort of what you do. And I'm calling out different projects over there and the working groups that are happening in that. Similarly, in security tooling, again, a lot of efforts coming out over there. It's really giving you the tools that you can leverage to secure your open source. And then, of course, diversity and inclusion is super important. As our customers are diverse, as our users are diverse, it's super important we get that diverse view across the community that makes the project that much more sustainable. And finally is the engaged pillar of it, where we are having more concrete projects like RS Tough and supply chain integrity, and projects like Alpha Omega, where we're trying to figure out the top 200 projects or 10,000 tail end projects. How can we improve the security of that? So there are different ways by which you can engage with the OpenSSF. A different perspective here. Now, if you think about it, in a typical software lifecycle, you are a developer, there's a source code, you build it, then you package it, and then if there are vulnerabilities identified, then you want to fix it, and then you keep updating it, then eventually there is a consumer as well. Right? That's your typical lifecycle, and that's what is shown on the top. And what this diagram does is it does a mapping of your typical SDLC with the different working groups that are happening within OpenSSF. That, hey, I'm a developer, I only care about building application and securing it. So then it kind of calls out what those numbers are. And they're color-coded so you can easily map that these are the efforts that I want to be engaged in. Or, hey, I'm more on the vulnerability information side of it, then it kind of calls out, what are the working groups and what are the efforts that you should be involved with. Again, we're going to make these slides available. So by all means, think about where do you fit into the life cycle, where does your team fit into the life cycle, then try to map yourself into those particular working groups. There are a lot of efforts that have been done over the last 3 years, I would say, within OpenSSF. And in OpenSSF, a project comes in. The project usually comes in at a sandbox level. which is the basic level. Basically, it defines that hey, project is very well aligned to the mission of OpenSSF. Comes at a sandbox level. Once you have enough diversity in terms of the maintainers, it's not a single member company commits, then it becomes like an incubation project. And once it has grown enough maturity, there's adoption, lots of customers adopting it, then it goes to the graduated side of the house. So that's sort of what the ladder looks like. And at the bottom layer, what you're seeing is the TBD, because these are some of the projects that we haven't yet categorized which of the category they will fit into. But if you look at it, hopefully some of these names are familiar with it. But my request would be hang around for the rest of the day. There are lots of wonderful speakers here who are pretty much giving detailed talks on these topics. Ask questions. Don't be afraid. Don't be shy. Ask questions on any of these projects. How is this project relevant to me? What can I do with the project? How can I contribute to the project? How can I make this project more relevant for my particular solution? So that's my really request from all of you here. As I mentioned briefly, there is a public policy working group as well within OpenSSF, and that's where a lot of the discussions happen. The Cybersecurity Resilience Act came up, earlier last year actually, and now this is being enacted. So there is a CRA expert group where we are having these deeper discussions. We have done SOS Policy Summit, which is specifically targeted towards working with the federal government. We have CISA working groups, Security Principles for Package Repository. These were the recommendations that have come out from CISA. So there's a very lot of tight work that happens between OpenSSF and the federal government, and it continues to evolve and operate. So I want to give us some context here. Why this logo of geese? If you understand, geese, they like to fly in a group together. And whenever they want to get attention, they're loud. They're very loud, and you cannot just miss it. And then you can see the armor and the whole robotic look is basically saying that, yep, we are ready to defend. And if there is a problem, we're going to honk it out so that people hear it. So really, what I would say, think of all of yourselves as a guardian of open source software. Speak up if there is an opportunity that we are not securing software, or if there is a place where we can secure software in a better manner. That's the best way to make open source better, is to participate really. And that's about it. So thank you very much. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day if you have any questions.